Jonathan Martin is Director of Inward Investment at the London Borough of Waltham Forest, which is one of the more active boroughs with 4 strategic growth areas, major projects like the Town Hall campus and Whipps Cross Hospital, together with plans for 18,000 new homes over the next decade, and its own development company, 60 Bricks. So Jonathan, tell me, why should I invest in Waltham Forest?
Good afternoon, Peter. That's a really good question, and one we've certainly worked on to make sure it's a question people find easier and easier to answer. We believe there's a number of reasons why you should invest in Waltham Forest, starting with the dedication and commitment from the political leadership that embraces growth. We think that's something that's absolutely important and imperative to get across to our residents, our investors, our potential partners, that if they invest in Waltham Forest, and when they do, they will get a dedicated service, not just from the political leadership, but also from the senior executive. So it stems pretty much from our leader, Councillor Claire Coggill, goes through to her portfolio lead members, including Councillor Simon Miller, who's my particular portfolio member, and also in terms of the senior executive around Martin Easton, the chief executive, and Stuart Murray, who's the strategic director that oversees our particular growth division. What that means for investors and developers and others that want to invest in the borough is you get a dedicated and committed route through to your investment being delivered. So what does that mean? We look at how we can tangibly make a difference, Peter. We've looked at what happened during COVID, and we maintained our planning regime as being the first London borough to have a near virtual planning committee on the 31st of March. That's been spoken about before, but it's not just about being first, it's about maintaining that position of wanting to keep delivering. We've kept pace with that. We've had further planning committees. Everything's pretty much gone virtual as in other parts of London. So that's the norm now. What are we doing to move on and build on that? We decided to get involved with something really unique to us at the time, which was an economic recovery action plan. And we launched that a couple of months ago now. And that really sets our real ambition for how we're going to work with businesses, investors, residents to keep that growth agenda going. And it's not just growth at any cost, Peter. It's got to be growth that protects investment for good, sustainable growth, as per the GLA's wishes and obviously what we want to see for our residents. Why should an investor come here? Why should you come and invest your time, Peter? It's something we want to get across in terms of the opportunities that we believe are within the borough. We've got a great heritage within the borough. We've got a number of town centres that jealously guard their character and have a lot to offer around the cultural agenda, around where they are in terms of green space. You know, we're the greenest borough to the north of the Thames. We've got cultural assets. We've got natural capital known as waterscapes, wetlands, parks and open spaces. That again mean when you come and work in the borough and invest in the borough, there's a lot of infrastructure to support you, both in terms of social infrastructure, but physical, hard infrastructure around the public realm as well. Where does the council position itself? It positions itself as a facilitator. It wants to make sure that it can deliver on public transport improvements, things that we may touch on in terms of public transport, pivoting towards private transport in terms of cycleways, how we can improve the health and well-being of our residents through better walking, better pedestrian routes. So that's important because that's where some of the employees for these new investors may well come from. You know, local residents are obviously imperative for us in terms of being local employees as well. What we're picking up on is that there has been a shift in terms of how we want to see ethical investment coming forward as well. That's clearly big in terms of the world agenda, and obviously ESG funding and investment around environmental, social and governance criteria are really important for us now. So as an investor coming into Waltham Forest, we want to see that social value that's captured and then recovered for our residents and potentially your employees. Where do we see that benefit coming through? If you come as an investor, you'll get exposed to our Invest Waltham Forest program, which is dedicated to ease your path through to understanding what the opportunities are, what the actual sites and locations and growth areas are, but also a better understanding of the culture within the borough and also the character we want to see that any development to a high quality can add to the borough. It's not a blank canvas. There have got to be places where there are already integrated communities that want to see the growth of those locations with sympathetic development that responds to the local character. And obviously that's something we're really keen to explore. Finally, what do we want to do in terms of encouraging investors into the borough? We've got a fantastic array of existing investors who are our most important investors because they're already here. They're already investing with us. They act as great advocates for the borough in terms of that peer-to-peer recommendation. We look at how we've supported our existing investors, whether they're public and or private investors, because we get a lot of public support as well. And that's where we look at working with the GLA especially and make sure we're attuned to what they want to bring forward. But importantly, we want to see that if we have got investors that have a particular angle, a particular sector they want to bring forward, we tailor that introduction to make sure we can explore that and make sure it's integrated in a mixed use way. We believe that a balanced and business-based economy that gives you that diversity of income, manufacture, is something we want to see benefiting our residents and our businesses going forward. I mean, that's a very, very high level sort of touch at why we think you should invest in Waltham Forest. And there's a plethora of other things I could go on about in terms of that, Peter.
So do you think outer boroughs like Waltham Forest will benefit at the expense of the central activity zone in a post-COVID environment?
It's a very good question. I think certainly there's the position that we've been adopting as an outer London borough, which is looking at how we can be more competitive, but also more resilient. And the impact of COVID has really brought that home, because we believe that resilience has really been born through being local to what you need. Again, it follows that sort of polycentric city approach. A lot of what our residents have needed to have near them have been near them because of our mixed and diverse business base. So we've had manufacturers and exporters of independent food locations where they've pivoted that to support feeding local residents. What we've seen in terms of the manufacturing base, some of the industrial areas have also helped our residents in terms of how they can stay local and support their local town centres. I think that sort of central zone is really, again, local to some people. And again, there's a big push for shop local. Now we can see it with some big international brands adopting that type of approach. We've certainly done a shop local campaign where we believe we want to keep our residents in the borough, because the daytime dwelling average has increased. Obviously, the daytime spend has increased as well. We've got to make sure our town centres are more vibrant, obviously with social distancing in mind because of the COVID impact, but we also want to make sure we can capture that income and make sure we can then utilise that income in supporting our local independent businesses, as well as the multinational and chains that are in the borough. But I think what you'll find is with the central area, central London, there are obviously local people within that area as well. Within the CAZ, there's over 230,000 residents. So, there's a big cohort of people also there. If we all start to adopt shopping local, I think obviously it improves on the impact on local businesses to see the footfall start to increase again. I think in terms of whether there will be a balance and how we look at that, if we look at the hard facts, Peter, we were a net exporter of employees going into a number of locations, including central London. So we'd see that drain of disposable income during the daytime, going into feeding that central London engine in terms of the food and beverage, the daytime economy and so forth. What we've been looking to do through our economic recovery action plan, and before that, our economic growth strategy, is strengthen the appeal of our town centres. We've got 8 town centres. We've got 3 town centres in particular now that we're looking at to really respond to the COVID impact around Leytonstone, Chingford and also Walthamstow. And it's how we can bring that pressure to bear to support those local town centres to keep people local. There's a big thing as well around how we look at safeguarding for our young people. And obviously as the population gets younger within the borough, it's around making sure we've got better safeguarding in place. So if people are shopping local, that's a better position for them to be. Obviously, I think there's going to be a rebalancing and a correction. Obviously, a lot of people are still a bit wary to go into central London. I think that may well change as we look towards what we've seen in the past. We saw some horrific events happen over the years where, for example, 9/11, people stopped flying for the best part of a year and a half. And you'd find lots of venues for music events or sporting events where there were just empty seats because people weren't traveling. And we saw how that, prior to COVID, bounced back. So again, this may well be a reaction to what we see, but we'll have to live past the impact of COVID and the initial impact being lockdown. I'm sure COVID's going to be here for quite some time. So it will be living with COVID, but adapting to a more flexible approach. And that's certainly what we're looking to do in trying to support London as a whole, because obviously Greater London forms part of London and the whole is bigger than some of its parts. but there may well be a correction in terms of people slowly starting to go back into central London as they start to feel more confident. What we're looking to do is support that with town centres, green space, cultural activities that get people that want to also come into the borough. We've got, as you know, good transport links, and we think that's something that will also help central London as well as Waltham Forest, which is people will be able to travel between both locations, and you may get a better balance in terms of that that live-work balance as people start to go back into central London. So I think it will be whilst there will be a short-term initial spike in terms of looking at people resting and remaining in their localities, there's going to be that longer-term need to revitalise the greater economy and getting people back to their offices.
Yes, I absolutely agree. So Waltham Forest was the first borough of culture. That was in 2019, and that seemed to be a great success as an event. But what sort of lasting impact has it had?
Again, that's a really interesting question. We did benefit from having a great bedrock of culture within the borough anyway, and got a great deal of support to support our bid in 2018 with over north of 12 to 14,000 supporters for our bid. In terms of the Borough of Culture itself, it was a success. There were lots of things we learned through that process, and we sort of set our sort of Borough of Culture tenets out on 5 bases, which were around culture as our identity, culture on every corner, how we could increase the cultural capacity of the borough, how we could start to offer culture as a career, which we thought again was a longer term aspiration for some of our residents in the borough, younger and older, and also culture importantly as a bond, which would bring people together. So we think some of the hard impacts we've seen have been around culture as an identity. There were over £4.1 million spent in the local area by local audiences. So there was an identity there that people had already realised, and they thought the Borough of Culture really brought that to the fore. We had over 500,000 visits in terms of people visiting for cultural events in the borough, with over 1,000 events put on up and down the borough. So again, there was a lot of activity going into that programme, Peter. We realised that, again, funding is always key in these things, and you need to have some kind of cocktail of funding to put these events on. And we achieved over £1.1 million of generated external funding and investment in the programme, which again supported these events going forward. I think what was also important in terms of the impacts were making sure we had culture on every corner, so that we had about 86% of all of our audience members were extremely happy with attending the events and the events themselves. We had, as I mentioned, over 1,000 events throughout the borough, and 67% of those attendees were local residents, so over 2/3 were local residents attending these events to really promote and showcase what the borough had to offer. What we learned from that was it did create that sort of bond between people, between residents and between communities, so they could start to experience exactly what was happening in their localities, what had been happening beforehand, which they may not have had exposure to because it was just happening as a matter of course. It could have been a smaller audience. But what we saw was that we could really start to identify the sort of DNA of the borough that ran through the various communities, and also the businesses that were there as well, in terms of how they could support this. In terms of residents, there was an awful lot of support, as we saw, from about 81% of our audience members, and they agreed that the events welcomed everyone. So that's a great sort of response. We think that has really led on to something I want to come on to in terms of the future legacy of where we're going with the Borough of Culture. I mentioned culture as a career, and again, it's got to be something of a lasting legacy, that we turned it from what was going to be a 1-year programme into a 10-year programme. And obviously that had to look at touching all of our schools. So we made a 100% impact on every school in the borough being touched by the programme and involved in some way, shape or form. Over 100 young people receiving work as part of this programme going forward. And over 64% of our volunteers were told that they gained and developed skills through the cultural programme, which they value going forward, including Legends of the Forest, as we badged them, which were our volunteers, our equivalent of the games makers from the Olympics, which made that whole process and experience far more smooth in wayfinding and directing visitors to the borough. In terms of the cultural capacity, we had to increase that capacity and really look at where we were with what we had as existing expertise within the borough. One of the things we learned as an amazing outcome was just the richness of cultural experts in the borough amongst the communities. We had lots of professionals also in the borough, and they were there willing to get involved. So overall, I think it was over 11,000 hours that were invested in providing these 1,000 events, which is huge. You know, there was the smaller program which we would support in terms of capital improvements to schools, and then we made a load of other grants available to support that sort of cultural approach from the ground up. So I think from that perspective, there was an awful lot of investment in the borough of culture itself. What has that led to in terms of going forward? Well, now we've got a virtual program which is of necessity the response to the impact of COVID over the spring and early summer. And I think where we are now is looking at how we can support that going forward, particularly as we've got so much more to do. We're working with our partners on how we can bring this forward. We've got a network of networks that really looks to harness the skills that we've learned going forward. It's about what we do from now on to bring culture into locations. We're buying into physical spaces, and we've got to be flexible about how we bring those forward, Peter, in terms of that direct impact going forward. We've purchased the EMD cinema site, which is going to be brought forward as a 1,100 seater comedy venue in the heart of Walthamstow. And again, because of the social distancing, we've got to look at the flexibility around that. How can we bring it forward and maintain that social distancing? We've got venues across the borough now that are being opened up in terms of that potential for flexibility. How will we deliver this culture? How will we make sure we've still got the physical assets to support the cultural programme as we move forward? Things we did learn that were really quite important though was how we could lever these skills and ambition that we have within our borough from our existing residents. So we've moved into far more of a commissioner of culture, as it were, and also working with experts that clearly know how to deliver these things as a network of networks, Peter. And I think for us, that's something we really want to look at, particularly around how this goes forward with our residents owning that cultural badge and that baton, as it were, to go forward into the future. So for us, there's been an awful lot that's come from that sort of cultural impact, and we really want to share that with others. We've been obviously working on the audits with the GLA and understanding some of the benchmarks in terms of what we said we would do and what we have delivered. And I think for us, that's how we can look to share that to our successors in terms of other London boroughs, but importantly how we can make this something embedded into our growth and development agenda. And that's something that's really key so that investors and developers can see what the return on investment is going to be for enhancing that sort of cultural offer. So what you might add, it adds to the rich mix of why people want to come and invest and live in the borough as well as work in the borough. So we think the Borough of Culture was a huge success. The lessons learned, the amazing gems we discovered, and also the support from our residents and the public sector in demonstrating we're a great business to do in terms of supporting culture. We've got the confidence of a lot of the funders that we will deliver as promised on our targets. And it's also making sure we understand what we need to do to enhance that and sort of percolate that out throughout all of our various communities.
Now, you've been ahead of the game, really, in terms of encouraging active travel with your Mini Holland programme, which started way back in 2013. So how successful have the improvements been for local businesses like the retailers in Walthamstow Village, who are much against the whole idea in the first place, but I think now have come round, haven't they?
They have, yes. I mean, again, it's something that started a good few years ago now. So we've been doing this for about 5 years at least. And the Mini Holland programme has been something that we've been really supporting as a clean way to demonstrate health and well-being is at the top of our agenda. Obviously, there's a whole thing around improving the wayfinding throughout the borough, and that's something we've got to look at going forward as well to make sure that that continues. But, you know, some of the things we've achieved have been amazing. We've got over 30 kilometres of segregated cycle track, and that's now been built and delivered, basically, Peter. We've got over 65 modal filters implemented, and that's where you have those pathways where only cycles can go through and not vehicles unless they're emergency vehicles. We've got over 430 bike hangers that have been installed as well, which is incredible producing over 500 spaces at stations for these bikes. So again, that's really important, and that's seen an uptick in terms of use over the COVID period. Around that sort of public realm, there's been over 40 public realm improvement projects and pocket parks. So this is something we've been really supporting to show it's pan boroughs, not just in Walthamstow Village or just other locations where people think there is just a focus around those locations. We've had 60 new crossings that have gone in and they've been improved, and over 700 new trees that have been planted as well. I think particularly for the village, what we've seen has been a real calming of the roads that was there, particularly Orford Road, where you'd have had traffic deliveries with vehicles parked on the road, which, whilst they're necessary, would have impeded the sort of pedestrian experience. They also clashed with obviously the school runs and children trying to get to school. So there was always that issue around safety with vehicles and pedestrians in near proximity. But what we saw did come forward, which we're really pleased about, was the ability that we had to bring forward these schemes and really support the residents. So this has been something that's really been important, because the businesses and the residents, particularly around places like Walthamstow Village, have really benefited from this more oasis environment. There's a great deal more cycling. We've done various reports on how cycling has improved over the years. What we've seen this year particularly has been a massive uptick in terms of cycling, not just at the beginning of the year, but particularly through the pandemic. So every metric measured over the last 4 or 5 years has shown that in terms of cycle usage, being counts of cyclists going through any particular area, they're all up on previous years. And that's something that's a clear testament for people wanting to obviously maybe get around the borough in a more healthy way, maybe avoid public transport perhaps. But again, it's improved the walking facilities, and they've used those facilities in terms of new pathways. There's been pocket parks and green spaces put in. And again, that's something we've really seen as a real benefit to sort of tie into the benefit of Enjoy Waltham Forest as we rebadged it. Again, that's something that just gave that message to people that whilst Mini Holland may have been the initial title, Enjoy Waltham Forest kind of is an ode to what we're trying to do. We're looking at the whole nudge theory of getting people to do more important things around their health and well-being and cycling and walking. So under the great championship of our deputy leader, Clyde Lokes, Councillor Clyde Lokes, we've seen that really increase, as well as on taking things such as zero emission deliveries, where we've had bike deliveries coming forward. So again, they've been working in the borough and supporting our businesses to deliver in between locations. So this whole thing around Enjoy Waltham Forest has been really significant. I've certainly seen a great deal of respect for it as I've taken investors, potential developers, advisors around the borough, where they can see how well it's been integrated into the existing sort of built fabric. There's been a lot of construction. So again, we've got to be honest about some of the impact. There has been some teething problems around obviously the amount of construction people have to deal with, but our residents have been excellent at A, voicing their concerns, but then B, understanding why we're doing what we're doing, and then supporting the actual benefit, and then using the actual facilities themselves, as I've mentioned and identified in terms of usage. So we think, particularly around some of these core areas, Walthamstow Village, Black Horse Village, Hoe Street and Wood Street villages, which have been the initial 4 that we've looked at to really measure the improvements. We've seen that sort of traffic calming. We've seen greater use of bikes. We've seen the increase of the bike hangers, cycle stores. We've seen the residents using their facilities, but also being able to better navigate towards local shops and improve that sort of business community in terms of footfall as well. So we think that really adds to improving the kind of home zones that we've wanted to create and give forward some sort of ode to the future, where there'll be far more separation between vehicles and residents, which can only be a good thing in terms of potentially removing that kind of traffic accident possibility.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Such an optimistic picture of Waltham Forest and what the local authority can do to build back better. So thank you very much indeed.
You're more than welcome, Peter.